Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the fifth Talking COVID-19 and Sport webinar, delivered in partnership between the Mayor of London and London Sport. These series have been developed in response to the current crisis in order to address the biggest issues facing London's physical activity and community sports sector and to offer practical advice. Thank you all for joining our discussion today, and we will be focusing on the children and young people and the ways sport and community sports sector can support them in the current situation. My name is Paulina Tsorkan, and I'm a policy officer at the community sport team at the Mayor of London's office. I will be chairing this meeting today, and before we begin, we'd just like to share a few housekeeping notes. So as previously mentioned, we have quite a few attendees joining the call today. So if you could all just ensure to keep your microphones off during the entire call and make sure that your videos are off as well. That will really help us with sound quality and minimize distractions. We'll be recording this entire session and we'll be sending it out to a wider audience a couple of days after. The recorded version will also have full captioning for accessibility purposes. Unfortunately, we're not able to provide it for the live session, but as I said, the recording will be captioned fully. There will be a Q&A at the second half of this section, and please feel free to submit your questions into the chat. You can either do that openly to the whole group, or if you feel more comfortable, you can submit them directly to myself or to my colleague, Kerry Atherton, who is on the call right now as well. So it's entirely up to you, but feel free to submit your questions throughout the entire session. Finally, we will also be sharing a few links and useful resources during the presentations today and in the chat as well. But do not worry if you don't get an opportunity to save them, as we will be including them in the resource and support pack after the session. Now, if I could have the next slide, please. My pleasure is to introduce today's speakers. So we will deliver this session with the experts in the field, who are Gary Palmer, who is a specialist advisor on children and young people at London Sport. Gary has 30 years of education and community sport experience in the sport and physical activity sector. He's been working with schools, colleges, local authorities, national organizations, and central government. He is the current chair of the Active Partnership Network National Children and Young People Advisory Board and a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on a Fit and Healthy Childhood and the Healthy Schools London Strategic Advisory Board. We also are joined today by Jack Shakespeare, who is Director of Children, Young People, Families and Research at UK Active. And in his current role, he is responsible for the agenda and direction of UK Active Kids, from research to policy, strategic projects and membership activation. And he works on identity and leadership of the UK Active Research Institute. He is committed to championing the benefits of physical activity and raising awareness and prominence of physical literacy for all children and young people. An outdoor adventure pursuer, he will be keen to tell us about his experiences himself. In terms of the running order for today, this will be no different from all of our previous workshops. The first half of the webinar will be dedicated to presentations from our speakers, first Gary and then followed by Jack. And then in the second half of the webinar, we will deliver a Q&A session with a few questions pre-submitted by attendees in advance, and the rest of them hopefully coming in from you later today. So with that, and without further ado, I will introduce Gary Palmer to you with his presentation on children and young people today.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Paulina. Welcome to everybody. I'd like to start by saying that although we're going to be looking specifically at the challenges facing young Londoners, this presentation isn't really unique to London. And the challenges that are facing young people are very similar across the whole of the country. And it just may be that because my focus and our focus is very London-centric, that we're very much aware of what's happening. But actually, this is obviously a nationwide problem, a worldwide problem. While lockdown was vitally necessary at the start of the spread of COVID-19, it's obviously made physical activity very, very difficult for young people. The government have done their best to keep young people active, encourage them to exercise with their families for up to an hour a day at the start of lockdown. And there are hundreds of individuals and organizations out there providing online activities. But in spite of that, the Daily Telegraph reported at the end of April that children's exercising levels are plummeting. New habits, same inequalities was also reported by Sport England to support this claim in a report that they published but just back at the end of May. So although we've got lots of virtual activity and some opportunities for new things, we are seeing inequalities broadening. The physical activity levels pre-lockdown are captured by Sport England through their Active Lives survey. And the caption that you can see now shows how actually London and that physical activity levels in London do seem to reflect the national picture as well. So on the far side, you can see in the light green colors, pre-lockdown, pre-COVID-19, the picture wasn't amazingly rosy. 47% of people, of young people under the age of 16, meeting the recommended levels of physical activity of 60 minutes on average, 60 minutes physical activity a day. And London, almost in line, 46%. And also you can see there wasn't much variance between primary school age children and secondary age children. Now, throughout lockdown, Sport England have been conducting and collecting data on habits and behaviours of both adults and children. And when you look at this published data, you can see that although we can see that there's been an increase in the amount of young people who are active for an hour a day, by the end of week 8 of the lockdown, we're still only up to a level of 22% of young people meeting that recommended level of an hour or more activity on average a day. We kind of would expect that, I suppose, in the situation that we're in. But it just sort of sets the scene, I suppose, of what we're likely to see when we return back to what the new normal might look like. Only last week, Street Games published some new research looking at young people's behaviours and attitudes during lockdown, and they reported that 68% of young people had said that they were less active than they were prior to lockdown. So the nature and the scale of what we're looking at is quite significant. So what are the issues? Why is this the case? Because it's not just as simple as the fact that because children aren't going to school, they're not being active. And in fact, schools are doing their best to keep young people active by sending home tasks and challenges, by the many virtual opportunities that there are out there trying to encourage and enthuse young people. But of course, the reality is that actually there are many factors that prevent people from meeting those guidelines. And in London, it's perhaps even more relevant because we know that where a person lives and the area that they grow up in is so important. And children from a lower socioeconomic background may not have access to any outdoor space. They may be restricted to a room or maybe 2 rooms. They may have no garden. They may have no outdoor space. And of course, that significantly restricts the amount of activity that could be possible. Most play areas and sports grounds and youth centres are all closed, those places where people traditionally are active, whether that be formal physical activity and sport or just recreational sport, activity and play. It's having a devastating effect. So safe community spaces where young people can play, they just don't exist right now. Not everyone has access to many of the online activities that are out there either. So although we assume putting activities online would be accessible, that isn't always the case. Not everybody has access to devices, not everybody has access to broadband. And if they do, they have to make a choice in terms of what do they prioritize. And in some instances, prioritizing a physical activity app might not be the most important thing for that family. Anxieties and fears also mean that exercise can sometimes be the last thing that people are thinking about. And I know last week on our seminar, we looked at some detail in terms of mental health challenges. For young people, those are just as important, if not more so. We don't know how this is affecting lots of young people. We're reaching out and we're trying to understand that. But whether we're talking about the most active, the least active, or the people who just take part and just do the recreational activities that they like, everybody will be affected in some way. And of course, with young people, the effect of the family is also really, really important. If the family aren't able to take people out to the parks for walks or for cycles, then obviously it becomes much harder for a young person to actually do that. And of course, where families involve key workers whose shifts might have changed, who may be working ridiculous hours in order to support the community and to support society, it makes it significantly harder. The street games research that I referred to earlier looked a little bit more detail at that. And their research pulled together some assumptions that many young people, particularly if they're in built-up areas, find that they're trapped in overcrowded housing. So it's not that they don't want to be active, they just physically can't be. They also emphasized how internet access was a massive issue. And they picked up on how a lack of structure to a day was also causing problems for young people as well. Having become so used to having a school timetable and doing things at certain times, all of a sudden that's gone. And that's quite challenging for a young person. So in terms of looking for solutions, there's obviously a number of things that need to be considered, but I just like to spend a bit of time just looking at two of these. One is to focus a little bit around the young person, and then secondly, to look at the organizations that these young people come into contact with. Of course, we're talking about multifaceted problem here, but if we can try to create some form of normality, some safe spaces, some safe places where young people can start to fall back in love with being physically active, we're at least moving in the right direction. That's why London Sport are committed to trying to unlock and make available more safe places to be active when the time is right. We're working with schools and school leaders to try to gain access to those buildings and those spaces, the playgrounds, the fields, all those areas where children can actually go and play in a safe environment. We recognize the fact that it's going to take time for local parks to open up properly and for the play areas to be available. But all we're talking about at the moment is space. And if we can create more of those and more opportunities, then hopefully we can start getting these young people back to some form of having physical activity in their normal life. We're also talking more to young people, and we're working with organizations like London Youth to actually be able to talk to those young people themselves. As I mentioned earlier, we don't know for sure how badly this is affecting these young people mentally, emotionally, and the only way that we're going to do that is to spend more time engaging with those young people, understanding the problems, and then starting to address those. In terms of organizations who work with young people, we've got a responsibility to ensure that they're still there when the young people emerge out of lockdown and start going back to some sort of normality. And in here, I'm meaning not the schools, because although the schools are really important, the schools will be there. They might need some help and some support in terms of what the activities look like in the spaces. What I'm particularly thinking about is those youth groups and those community groups who provide such a fantastic service for young people. They desperately need investment. They desperately need funding to keep them going. They've been going for the last 3 months, 4 months with very little income. And in some respects, they play such a massive part in the solution. We really need to ensure that we invest in those organizations. Street Games call those organizations LTOs, locally trusted organizations. But we've all got organizations out there, be them youth groups, be them recreational groups, be them football teams, sports teams. There's hundreds of them out there. They're all in a very difficult space right now. We also need to provide guidance and help in terms of what that new normal looks like. There's lots of guidance out there. The government are constantly updating, revising guidance in terms of what socially distancing sport looks like, what things people can do and what they can't do. And sometimes turning those into practical solutions can be quite difficult. So I think we've all got a responsibility within the industry to try and simplify that, to try and make it easier for those organizations to help return to normality, to help providing that service for young people. So in summary, I think we really need to take this as an opportunity now to start shaping an active future. As I said right at the start, we had a situation where we had almost 50% of the young population who were meeting that 60 minutes per day guidelines. Wouldn't it be great if the new normal actually becomes higher than that? If we can convince more people to recognize the benefits of being active, perhaps as a consequence of being locked down and seeing what effect that can have. But let's do that in a truly inclusive way. Let's listen to young people more, and let's create a positive physical activity habit that stays with them for life, rather than just through their childhood years. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gary, for this excellent overview, presenting both issues and solutions, both in London and nationally. I would like to hand over to Jack now for the UK Active perspective.
Thank you, Paulina, and thank you, Gary, and a big thank you for inviting me today. I think, Gary, that one of your first statements, the same habits, same inequalities, is I sense that's going to be a key theme for this session, and whatever new normal we step into, and we forge. Sort of moving ahead, then what we certainly can't do, and what we certainly cannot let ourselves do, is slip back into the old normal and those old and very stubborn issues around inequalities. We have to find a way to tackle those and break those down. For context, I'm from an organisation called UK Active. We're a not-for-profit membership body representing the physical activity sector. Our membership is broad, therefore our remit is broad, and certainly when when this crisis and when the current sort of situation developed itself, we had an immediate focus. That immediate focus from us as a membership body was to support the sector to navigate their way through what was and what still is, to a large extent, a very complex and uncertain situation, and I think that is certainly still the case now, and it will be the case as we sort of venture onwards, and as we start to look at, like Gary's quoted earlier, what a new normal is going to be. And that was from an operational, financial perspective. There was a lot of navigating, a lot of sort of leadership required in that space. But also how to support our members in the physical activity sector, to support and keep levels of engagement with the audiences in which they normally work with. So that was a big focus of ours, and remains to be. I think some key pieces of work in that area. Well, number one, we developed a 4-step strategy to reopening the leisure sector safely and in a financially viable way. And in fact, today we launched a public campaign on that, on how we are going to do that and how we're going to support the sector to do that, recognising community leisure and community sort of sports facilities as integral cornerstones of physical activity in local communities. Another big piece of work we have done is provided sector reopening scenario modelling with our research institute. So data analysis that has enabled us and the sector to understand recovery rates, resilience curves. When under different types of restrictions and at different time intervals, when can we expect the sector to start really getting back up to sort of full capacity? When can we start expecting it to get back up to so the levels of participation and activity that we were looking at last year? Because without it, we're looking at lots and lots of missed visits and clearly a decrease in participation, but also the social value impact that comes with that. The longer facilities are closed, the longer people are unable to engage in their typical sort of physical activity or sporting habits, it takes a really quite sizable negative impact on the social value of sport, physical activity. I think that's something that we need to really consider. And then thirdly, and maybe more specifically to this forum, is that we worked with the Department for Education closely when it was announced that schools were closing, although they didn't really closed. I think just reduced occupancy. Is we worked with the DfE to provide guidance to any of our members that were still being that were still supporting schools during this time, and developed a code of conduct so that they understood how to work with schools during coronavirus. So some examples of how we've helped the sector and how we've supported the sector there. I think from a children and young person's perspective, but I dare say this probably resonates more broadly as well. I think we, and as we look ahead, there's a few challenges for the sector, and those challenges will be easier to overcome the closer we work together. I think number one is, and probably a very more practical point, is that we need to look really closely at how do we get youth sport, youth physical activity back in a safe way, and for lots of community sport in an economically viable way as well. But importantly, how do we do it so that it's in a meaningful way, so that it resonates with children and young people? Because Gary showed us the stats, and it doesn't look great. And we're not doing a very good job at raising physical activity levels across wider groups of children and young people. So however we get that back, we need to make sure that it's meaningful and that it's relevant. I think that leads into the second point, that we need to make sure that whatever we do get back is not simply a reboot of what we had before, and we don't fall back into allowing those inequality barriers and accessibility issues that hold it back and that hold participation back. And I think we, as a sector, we've got a real job and a responsibility and duty to make sure that we don't allow ourselves to slip back into that. And then I think thirdly is, how do we use this current situation as a real opportunity to learn, to drive, unearth innovation, harness collaboration. I think in my time of working in this sector, I've never sensed a greater sense of collaboration, and I think we need to capture that and to drive that forward, so that the new normal, I don't know, I'm sure as a society we're going to get bored of that phrase, a new normal, but so that a new normal is desirable to wider groups of children and young people that before this we were engaging. And I think that's a big job. And then I think more broadly, there's a real opportunity, physical activity, exercise, health has never been more prominently discussed at the top, with scientific advisors talking to us through the television, in the evenings, about the importance of exercise, about the importance of physical activity. I think it's important now, as a sector, we really rally behind that and continue to show the social value, the positive impact of the sector, of sport, of physical activity across the ages, and really make sure that whatever the outcome of the inquiry of coronavirus is, physical activity, sport, health is at the centre of recommendations going forward. From a prevention perspective, but also from a rehabilitation perspective. And I think we could unpack those two words all day. But that's where we're at. I'm really excited to be on today. Thank you very much, and keen to work with Gary to get stuck into these questions.
Thank you, Jack. That was excellent. Gary, if you could please stop screen sharing, as we are now moving into the Q&A session. Just to let everybody know, we've had quite a few pre-submitted questions coming in and quite a few questions in the Q&A section. Thank you everybody for those. Keep them coming, and I will try grouping questions thematically a bit more so that we make sure to cover as many issues as possible. So the first one is a biggie, to be honest, and I think both Gary and Jack might want to begin to unpack it. So the question is, how can sport clubs support schools and youth provision under social distancing? And the second half of the question is it possible to put together a resource for coaches trying to adapt their sessions to comply with social distancing? I might be able to add my 2 cents at the end of it, but please, Gary, if you'd like to start.
Yes, of course. Yes, is the simple answer to that. Of course, we need to be working with our coaches, with our teachers, with our schools, in order to understand what socially distancing sport looks like. And as you're probably already aware, there's a lot of guidance out there, and it's developing and changing positively each day as we start to understand it more. What I am very conscious of, though, is that at the moment it's being left up to individual clubs, coaches, or organisations to interpret that themselves and to identify ways in which to actually implement it. So I think that there will be a great value to the sector actually helping to do that. And I know that this is something that London Sport are very keen to try to achieve. At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a significant number of online activities at home, which started coming around. And we were, in response to some questions from the sector there, we tried to simplify that by creating a platform on our website that basically just tried to filter through the slightly better ones, the ones that perhaps were most appropriate, and to group them so that people could make an informed choice. What we'd like to do in terms of understanding what socially distant sport looks like is to do the same, really. And we are currently working and partnering with the GLA on a socially distanced pilot, which is taking place in Hackney starting next week with a number of coaches, which I've probably stolen your thunder now, Paulina, and apologies if I have. But we're very excited to actually see practical implementation. Coaches actually working with some young people and actually trying to bring this to life, because that's what's important. And for me, it's about sharing our learning. As a sector, we sometimes become quite protective, and we need to stop thinking about ourselves as our own individual organizations and start sharing a little bit, like Jack alluded to earlier. When we hear good practice, when we hear things that are working, let's shout about it, let's tell others about it, and let's learn so that we actually make it easier for us as a sector to recover rather than just trying to promote individual organizations.
Jack, would you like to add anything to that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just from my perspective, I totally agree with Gary. I think access to tools and resources that show best practice is always reassuring. Myself as a volunteer sports coach, the availability of those types of resources, quality resources, obviously is always helpful. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of getting the workforce back out. And working with young people in whatever sport or physical activity capacity, but they've got to be able to do it with confidence. They've got to be able to do it with reassurance. And part of my job and part of UK Active's job is to keep working with government, keep communicating with government to make sure that communication from government is as clear as possible as well. And I think that's going to be really important. There's also some great bodies in our sector that will produce some great resources, and I know UK Coaching are producing some resources, I think, as we speak, in regards to helping coaches in this sort of socially distancing world at the moment.
Thank you. Yes, as promised, my 2 cents. I completely agree with everything that's been said above, and I guess, as we know, there is quite a lot of guidance going around, both government and produced by sporting bodies. However, so far it's all fairly theoretical, as it's an unprecedented situation and we haven't really had an opportunity to test it and pilot it and see if it works. So this is why at the Mayor of London we're partnering with community sport organisations to test on fairly small scale in Hackney a pilot that would allow young people of different ages to engage in socially distanced, safe activity. And this will allow us to set the parameters of what realistically socially distanced sport means and how this can be introduced in practical solutions for this summer and perhaps the months to come. So hopefully that was of use, and please keep your eyes peeled. We will be communicating this to organizations wider, as again, this is something that's produced to provide further guidance to the community sports sector. So the next question follows quite closely and is asking for the ideas on keeping children and young people active and occupied during the summer holidays, especially as playgrounds remain closed. Also, if there is any guidance for the organizations who want to support young people during the summer holidays, but are concerned with the number of challenges that they experience. And finally, if there is any funding that might, which you are aware of, that is emerging to support these type of programs. Again, I've crammed quite a few questions, but I think they all respond to the theme of keeping young people safe and active during the summer holidays and the ways to do that. So I will start with Jack now, but I think it's again equally valid for both of you.
Yeah, absolutely. Timing's everything, right? Yeah, we talked about the overwhelming need to get not just the workforce back out confidently and safely working with children and young people, but we need to make sure that we give young people and their families the confidence to get back out and be physically active in this world, this balancing act of sort of controlling coronavirus, but understanding that we need to get people moving around. And I think the summer holidays will become a really important time. I'm sure everyone has followed the news over the last 24 hours in regards to schools, and a lot of schools not opening or reopening, or at least increasing their occupancy until September. We're looking at a generation of young people that are lots are facing up to over 5 months away from school, and the implications on that are hundredfold, right? From an attainment perspective, socialization perspective, and that will all those impacts will disproportionately impact children, more vulnerable children, and children from more disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think with the right conditions, there's an opportunity this summer to engage and provide those physical activity opportunities. Gary touched on one of the key areas of work, of many, that he and his team are working on around school facilities. We believe at UK Active there's a real opportunity this summer, again in the right conditions, to use school facilities as safe spaces to engage children and young people across the summer holidays, keeping select schools open in the right areas, working with those locally trusted organisations that Gary's referred to earlier to provide those safe experiences in those safe spaces to deliver these what we've talked about in regards to really important physical activity and sport experiences. The opportunity to get positive role models back in front of children and young people this summer is going to be really important. But again, there's a big caveat on making sure it's the right conditions. So summer's a bit. I think summer will play a really important role in this. Not least as it could provide a transition back into school in September, and we could really use physical activity and sport at the heart of that to get children back together, albeit in different size groups, and try to offset some of what will undoubtedly be some negative implications of being out of school for such a long amount of time. I think just one last thing for me on that, I think, and this will be different across different groups, but a focus on family activity as well is probably quite important. Giving families the confidence, the tools to get out and use their local parks and engage in physical activity experiences with their children, their families, is an important message as well. And I think we need to do what we can as a sector to ensure that all families of all backgrounds have the spaces and like I say, the confidence to go out and do that.
Yeah, and I'd just like to follow on from that, Paulina, and in many respects, for me, very similar to Jack, for me, this is about reducing inequality, because we know that the gap has got greater. So the summer months really needs us to start trying to grapple with that and trying to look at, when we're going to be testing ideas, where's the right place to do that? It's where the people need it the most. And we know that that's been the case in certain London boroughs, in certain areas in London. That's where we really need to focus our attentions. It's the young people who couldn't afford to go out to perhaps to pay for things. That's what we need to be looking at. And also doing things differently, going perhaps to youth centres, going to organisations where we've got youth workers, where young people might feel comfortable coming together. The issue of mental health with young people is going to be a massive issue. And coming out of lockdown, when people haven't had that free association, where they haven't, it's not just a case of not being sport, they haven't actually mixed with each other. So we have to manage that as well. And in some respects, putting that in a trusted area, in a trusted space with youth workers that actually are able to cope in those situations, I think vitally important for me. Second part of that question as well, in terms of funding, I think it's really important that we look at investment at a local level, because as I mentioned earlier, those local trusted organizations are only there because they are funded in most instances by the membership fees or by local authorities, who right now actually are in a very difficult position. So Sport England actually had an emergency fund, which they put out there, and they got a lot of money out very, very quickly. And I know that they're looking at additional rounds to that. I also know that London Sport are looking at putting some funding, making some funding available, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about that a little bit later at some time in the near future. There are funding opportunities out there. Come to London Sport, talk to our funding officer. Let's see what's out there for you, because we need those organisations to exist. And without them, we're in a much more challenging position. And we really need to try and work together to come to a solution over the next few weeks.
Thank you so much, both. And just to reiterate the latter point about funding, a lot of it has been concentrated on emergency response very early in the crisis, and right now it's almost like a new page that needs to be looked at and considered. And please do keep an eye on the follow-up email with the recording of this webinar and the resources, as you will find out how to get in touch with London Sport and speak to somebody to discuss your funding access issues. So thank you for this. The next question is also a really big and important one, always, and particularly in the moment, is as follows. With everything that is happening right now in terms of the equality issue and Black Lives Matter, how do you see the power of sport helping young people to restore equality and protect their lives and just provide a more equitable solution in terms of community sport? I would like to hear from Jack on this with his policy and political cap, but would be interested to hear Gary's opinion as well.
Yeah, I saw that one come through. It's a huge, really big and extremely important question. I think at the root of this needs to be a seismic effort and political will at every level to fix what is clearly a broken system, fix a system that doesn't work for everybody, and one that offers equal access to opportunity. We've got to really look inside here to understand what's not working, and have a real desire and a real political will, and energy and enthusiasm behind it that doesn't wane with a hashtag, to really look at the system and really look at what we need to do to make sure that there is equal access to opportunity. I reflected on young people's experience of this moment, and forgive me for sort of airing some of my thoughts on this, but I think children and young people are voiceless victims of this coronavirus, and I think without a voice you become frustrated, and without a voice you become detached, or not detached, but you become you feel like maybe you're separated from the issue. And whether that's victim because of direct trauma because of coronavirus, whether it's an impact on themselves or someone in their family, or through, again, back to one of my points, or through because of coronavirus and because of the situation they're now facing over 5 months out of school. This will have a significant impact on children and young people, and without a voice, without a platform, you forgive them for becoming frustrated, and forgive them for feeling detached from the communities in which they live in. And I think sport, without sounding too preachy, I think sport has a real ability, or an inclusive sport offer has a real ability to give them a voice, a real ability to enable young people to bridge back to their local communities, to connect to their local communities in a positive way. And I think a comment from earlier, surround them with local positive role models that enable them to harness that voice and project that voice, not suppress that voice. I think that's really important. I think we need to do a really good job at listening to people. Gary's talked about that, listening to young people, but instead of facing conflict with more conflict, let's listen to people, let's understand the frustrations, and then let's use that in this seismic effort to fix the system. I think that's a really important part of this, and as I say, it goes back to that, making sure there is equal access to opportunity for everyone.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you. That was a really good overarching response. I would be really interested in also finding a bit more about specific action, especially since we know that Black and Asian ethnic minority groups are disproportionately affected by COVID. So perhaps, Gary, you might know anything about the specific guidance or any safeguarding measures that can help us reintroduce sport in a way that ensures safety of London's communities.
Yes, absolutely, Paulina. I just want to echo what Jack has just said in terms of, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated inequalities. But when we're looking at a solution, actually, could this be an opportunity for us to address this at the same time and to redress this? Because those local communities, those local role models, they're the part of the solution. And actually, being part of the sporting solution could actually be part of addressing the inequality issue as well. Because irrespective of color, background, gender, or religion, actually those people in the community that can help to pull the community back together as one are vitally important for us to come out of this successfully. And I can certainly see that the sport does unite. It can unite. It can overcome barriers caused by race, by color, by gender. And I think we need to emphasize the positives wherever we possibly can. In answer to your second question, in terms of safeguarding, I think it's crucially important that we ensure that when we look at what the new normal looks like, that we follow the guidance and the procedures that are there, because it would be quite easy just to slip back to doing things that we've done previously. And actually, maybe it's just a case of reminding ourselves in some respects, in terms of what is good practice, what should we be doing. We've created specific safeguarding pages on London Sport to try to address that, to try to help organisations and groups working with young people to recognise that. I'm aware that young people are becoming more clear on this themselves. In my own household, my kids are more aware of this now. I would also emphasise that there's a little bit of uncertainty from them in terms of wanting to go back to normal activity. But recognizing that when you go back to playing football, playing tennis, there are new things that you have to consider. And I think the more that we actually reinforce that in a safe way, but not in a scary way, so that kids realize that that's the way that things are done. Actually, they can help us to come out through this very successfully. And I think that the issues that we're having at the moment around Black Lives Matter, absolutely sport can play a role. And I think the more that we can recognize that, perhaps even without necessarily needing to emphasize it, we're in such a multicultural society in London. Actually, everybody can be part of that new normal.
Thank you. I feel there's been a lot of important points about nourishing London's communities and also reinstating that sense of dignity when human lives are at risk, and just making sure that we do build back better. There's another question here that's very specific that might be quite interesting to discuss. So I assume that somebody who works in a community sport organization or clubs working with girls between the ages of 11 and 16 who have recently mentioned that their parents have been putting on a lot of pressure for them to train, saying that their colleagues might have been training more, and the person presenting this question feels that the pressure might have been so high because the parents feel that there isn't enough support from their PE teachers and coaches, who usually would be the ones providing that inspiration and guidance. So the question is, what do you think the solution here might be? How would you suggest handling this with parents? And generally, if you would like to unpack this a little bit further.
Okay, I'll go first, Jack.
Feel free.
I'll take that one. I mean, to take the issue of gender, Paulina, I mean, in the first instance, we've seen the data suggests and has shown that there is a significant decrease in levels of physical activity from young people, from young girls compared to young boys, a more significant. So we see a drop-off in physical activity levels from young people as they go through their teenage years. That drop is steeper amongst girls. Number of factors, number of reasons for that. I mean, I'd like to think, having previously been an educator, that isn't all the school's responsibility and all the school's fault, because actually society in some respects might condition that, might create the conditions where it's less likely to be active. That being said, there have been some really good examples where the balance has been redressed, and I think the best examples that I've seen have been where the young people have played a role in what that content looks like. They've started to shape what the activity looks like. The issue with overtraining and doing too much, and perhaps being pressed a little bit harder, in many instances, that sometimes come from the coaches or from the adults who are overseeing the group. That being said, there are some very driven young people out there, young female athletes out there who do want to achieve very, very well. So we do have to be a little bit cautious there. But from my perspective, I think it's really important that we involve young people in the decision making, and we help them to shape what the activity offer looks like. And I think there we've got more likelihood of those people choosing to be involved. Variety is really important. Fun is really important as well, and being perhaps less prescriptive and listening more to young people might be part of the solution.
Thank you. Jack, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, just to echo Gary's sentiments there, I think, the stark reality is that girls are less active than boys at every age group during school. And I think there's a job for us to do to reframe, and a job for us to do to change the hype around what physical activity and sport is to girls and young women and means to them. I think we talk about meaningful activity, and part of that reframing is to start to talk about sport and physical activity as in a very holistic way. This isn't just about the physical. This is about our mental and our social well-being as well. And if we can start to frame physical activity in all its guises more holistically, we can really start to talk in a more meaningful way to the children and young people that we are we are looking to engage, but everyone around them, and sort of looking at that sort of socio-ecological viewpoint, and what is around these children and young people. I think we really need to build that out and start to look at how do we reframe the messages about physical activity and sport, with all the individuals, all the organizations, all the institutions around that young person. Gary's right. The most successful intervention programs I've sort of come across in regards to girls' participation are the ones where girls and young women have led it and have been part of that creation process. And it's really important that we're not parachuting in intervention programs here, because it's worked with one group at this end of the country. It will definitely work with another group at the other end of the country. It probably won't, because of different cultures, different beliefs, different ways of doing things, different access, you name it. There's a whole list. So the ability to put that young person, in this case, that young woman, that girl, at the heart of this is really important. And I think it's a big job, right? There's a lot of us, and Gary's right. This is not just a role of school. This is a role of everybody around that young person. It takes a whole village. So for me, it's about that reframing and exploring what physical activity is and what it means to people, from that much more sort of holistic perspective.
Thank you. I'm aware that we have about 7 minutes left, so we'll try and keep questions grouping by the themes. And if we have anything unanswered, we will ensure to get back to you after this meeting. But there's been a lot of questions around access to facilities, especially as they start reopening to community groups. And if you could share some tips and guidance, especially I think UK active perspective would be valuable in this, both in terms of the practicalities of reopening facilities and managing relationships with facility owners. Would really like to hear from you, Jack, on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously a massive part of this, and at one end of this conversation, we've got and are reliant upon clarity and clear government guidance. We're at a very important time now politically in regards to the reopening of different sectors, and a very important time period in this run up to summer, in regards to what the sports, health, leisure, fitness sector looks like in its broadest domain. And like I referenced in the introduction, what we've done in that space at the moment is to provide the leisure sector, predominantly that community leisure sector, with a framework, a sort of a standard operating framework on how to reopen safely. And with different restrictions in place. What we're also doing is looking ahead to the summer holidays, like I talked about earlier, and really viewing school facilities as potential safe spaces for children and young people to go and engage in physical activity. And again, what we're producing is a safe operating framework to address some of those safety issues and safety concerns, to make sure that what is being delivered and how it's delivered is in the safest way, possible. I think in regards to sort of local community organisations working with facilities, I think it's one of the biggest learnings for me over this last few weeks has been the work we've done with the sector to ensure that any third parties that have continued to work with schools during coronavirus have had the guidance to do so in a safe way. It's been low levels, thankfully, but importantly, and at the heart of that guidance was sitting down with the senior leadership team and really understanding what the protocol is within that particular facility. All facilities are different. All facilities house different groups of people with different ways of doing things. So really having an understanding of how that facility works, and some of the protocols that are in place. But it's a massive part, and our ability to reopen facilities in whatever guise to make sure that we can deliver physical activity again in the safest possible way is absolutely crucial. And we can't rush into that. This has to be done safely. But as we stated earlier, we are always at the whim of the current situation and how well this R rate or the R number is doing.
Just to follow on from that, Paulina, and before the COVID-19 lockdown, we'd started
Completely
a pilot.
agree.
Sorry.
No, please go on. I'll have a follow-up question after that.
Sorry, Paulina. I was just going to say that prior to the COVID-19 lockdown, London Sport had just started a pilot with 4 schools in Croydon at looking at opening access to their school facilities to the community to create these safe spaces. As I think some of our colleagues today have mentioned, obviously those schools are now a little bit reluctant at the moment to provide that access that we had been hoping, but we're now working with them with Jack's Safe Operating Framework from UK Active to try to do that. And I think, although it may be that things will be delayed, I'd like to think that at some stage in the near future, those schools can be part of that solution and creating a community hub to enable organizations and clubs to go in and to allow physical activity to take place in a safe space.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a 1-sentence response follow-up question. Do we know what the demand, or rather what the offer from the schools is like, and are the schools interested in being those sites of returning to physical activity? And do we know the answer to that question?
Well, I think from my perspective, Paulina, I think schools are a little hesitant at the moment because they're still getting their heads around how they can welcome students onto the school site at a socially distanced and safe space. So actually welcoming community groups is very much secondary to that, and which I totally understand. And I think from our perspective, it's more a case of absolutely when the time is right, let's do that. And also let's look at the outdoor spaces, because we know that we're safer outdoors at the moment. We're not talking like an Olympic standard badminton court. We're talking about the school playing field, the school playground, and actually just having a gate around the outside so that people can come in and can be active safely, knowing that there is that protection around them.
Thank you. I am aware that we have 1 minute left, so I think it will be appropriate to close with a question that is, how can we ensure to include young people and young people's voices in decision-making in the current climate, especially given that a lot of the decision-making has been very crisis response and very top-down led. So how can we reverse that and reinstate youth leadership?
Well, from a London Sport perspective, we reached out to some community groups that we're currently already working with. So we're working with London Youth about using their Dare London platform. What I'd like to do is to offer or to put an offer out to everybody who's on this call, that if you have got a youth organization, if you've got a youth voice as part of that organization, please contact me, let me know, because we want to work with all young people within limitations. We have to make sure that we manage our own resources. But if there's an opportunity to get some youth voice and there's a platform there, please contact me directly, and we'd love to work with them to give them a voice to help start shaping what that future might look like.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, agree with that. Of course I do. Yeah, and Gary's and the team at London Sport are creating a really good platform for that. I think what would I say? Commit to it. Commit to having a young person at the beginning and throughout the process of programming, of decision making at a local level, at an organisation level. Commit to it. It doesn't take much. Bring them in and talk to them. I think what we can't do is just have another token youth panel that's been used as a moment in time consultation group. I think what we need to strive towards is having young people embedded in the system at a grassroots level, organisation level. Let's see if we can get one in the cabinet office as well. But so that they are part of the system, and that whenever the systems are making decisions at any level, we know that it's had input from from young people in it. I think we really need to look at how do we commit to that? How do we make sure that we are radically diversifying the people within the system, so that whenever decisions are being made and ideas are being thought of, we've got that input from those groups of people. So yeah, commit to it.
Thank you both. Thank you. That was excellent. I know we have overrun by 2 minutes, but I think I will sneak in one last question, and I will want you to answer in 3 words. So what would you suggest as the top 3 factors in organizations helping young people to safely return to sport? Can be less than 3 words, but no more.
Follow the guidance.
Make it meaningful.
Thank you both. As I said before, I'm aware we've had lots and lots of questions coming both into the Q&A and the chat and privately. We will ensure to respond to all of you directly. We'll be following with the recording of this webinar in a couple of days and with useful resources and guidance attached. Thank you everybody for taking the time to join the webinar. Hopefully it was fruitful, useful, interesting for you all, and thank you again.